Well, you've landed at Ritualistically Botanica. If this is your first time here, welcome. My name is Mo, and I'm your host. Today, we're doing something a little different. We're going back, way back, before Einstein, before airplanes, back when electricity itself still seemed halfway between science and sorcery. I'm going to tell you about a man who wrote about invisibility. He wrote about invisibility and time travel before H.G. Wells. He wrote about a mechanical brain, teleportation, machines that could calculate and think, and questions about the limits of speed before Einstein gave physics the modern answer, 31 years before Einstein. And for over 100 years, almost nobody remembered this man's name. His name was Edward Page Mitchell. Now, Mitchell was born in 1852 in Bath, Maine. His family later moved to New York City, and when he was only 11 years old, he lived through the New York draft riots of 1863 during the Civil War. Mobs in the streets, buildings burning. His family eventually got him out of New York and sent him south for a while, like I think to North Carolina. Then, as a young man, Mitchell was involved in a serious accident and he lost his sight. Now, doctors managed to save one eye. The other was eventually replaced with a glass eye. And while he was recovering, unable to see, he began writing one of his earliest science fiction stories. Now, sit with that. The man was lying there unable to see the world around him, and his imagination is running straight through the walls. He goes into journalism eventually in his life and becomes editor-in-chief of the New York Sun, one of the most important newspapers in America at the time. He holds that position from 1897 until 1926. And yes, this is the same newspaper associated with the famous, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. But here is where Mitchell disappears. Between the 1870s and 1880s, he wrote dozens of strange, speculative stories for the newspaper. And he didn't sign any of them. That was evidently common newspaper practice at the time. Stories could appear anonymously right alongside ordinary reporting. So generations of readers knew the stories, but not necessarily the man who wrote them. When Mitchell died in 1927, his science fiction was barely mentioned. And then, decades later, science fiction historian Sam Moskowitz began digging through old newspapers and identifying Mitchell's work. He eventually called him one of the lost giants of American science fiction. And when you actually look at what Mitchell wrote, you understand why. Let's start with one of his first short stories, which was The Tacky Pump. Our narrator is a young man named Furnace, and he falls in love with his mathematics professor's daughter. Her name is Abscissa, Abscissa. Evidently, that is a mathematical term. Her father named his daughter after the mathematical term for the horizontal coordinate on a graph. Victorians apparently had their own forms of child abuse, but then look at Elon Musk and the weird names he gave his son. The professor refuses to approve the marriage unless Furnace can solve an impossible problem. He needs to achieve infinite speed. So Furnace goes to his tutor for help, and the tutor casually begins describing a collection of ridiculous inventions, an android that performs calculations and writes sonnets, a tunnel straight through the earth, impossible mathematical problems somehow solved, and finally, the tacky pump. Imagine a train riding on top of another train. The bottom train moves 40 miles an hour. The train sitting on top moves 40 miles an hour relative to the train under it. Now, from the ground, theoretically, you're moving 80 miles an hour. Then put another moving train on top of that one, and then another, each one adding its own speed. Mitchell's fictional idea was that if you could continue stacking motion upon motion, you could eventually approach infinite speed. And Furnace gets the girl. Mitchell ends the story basically asking, why shouldn't it work? Now here's the important part. I am not telling you that Edward Page Mitchell predicted Einstein. He didn't. What fascinates me is that Mitchell was already playing with the questions decades earlier. Is there a limit to speed? Mitchell's fictional answer was essentially, maybe not. Why do these people were thinking of those things? They must have been extremely bored. Well, I guess he was bored because he was healing a blind eye. So Mitchell's fictional answer was essentially, maybe not, just keep adding velocity. 31 years later, in 1905, Einstein published a special relativity. And modern physics says no to Mitchell. You can accelerate something with mass closer and closer to the speed of light, but you cannot simply keep stacking ordinary velocities until you blast past it. So Mitchell did not discover relativity. He did something else. He got to the question. And that is going to become important throughout this series, because sometimes imagination walks into the room before science does. Let's go to 1877, The Man Without a Body. And this one is wonderfully grotesque. This is another one of his stories. Our narrator comes across a living human head sitting on a shelf, and it's talking. The head belongs to Professor Dummkopf. Dummkopf explains that he invented something called the telepomp. The idea is astonishingly simple. Break matter down, transmit it through a telegraph wire, reconstruct it on the other end. First experiment, a cat. Apparently the cat arrives intact. So the Professor Dummkopf thinks, well, obviously the next logical experiment is me, because why not, right? Scientists have apparently always suffered from the same condition, no adult supervision. So he begins transmitting himself head first. Everything seems to be working, and then the battery dies. I laugh because this is exactly something that would happen to me. Only his head makes it through. Must have been a Mercury retrograde. So now we have a living severed head sitting on a museum shelf explaining his experiment. But again, don't let the joke hide the question. Mitchell was living during the communications revolution of the telegraph. For the first time, human beings could convert information into a signal, send it across enormous distances, and reconstruct the message somewhere else. So Mitchell takes the idea one step further. If information can travel through a wire, what else could? Matter? A body? Could something as complicated as the information inside a human mind be transmitted or reconstructed? Now, hold that thought, because nearly 150 years later, we are still wrestling with questions in that same family. We have neural networks, brain-computer interfaces, digital models of language and cognition, scientists mapping neuroactivity, machines capable of reproducing aspects of human communication, recognition, reasoning, and memory-like behavior. I am not saying we have copied a human brain into a computer. We have not. But Mitchell was already poking at an enormous question. How much of a human being can be represented as information? That question is still sitting right here in front of us now. Then comes 1879, and he writes The Ablest Man in the World. And this one may be the closest Mitchell gets to something that sounds painfully modern. The story involves a rising Russian political figure named Baron Savage. Russia and Baron, I don't know why. This is not related to the Little Baron Trump's Great Adventures. Different author, but there's the name again, and there's the country, and there I go. He had once been a profoundly impaired boy living in an institution, this guy. Then an inventor, part physician, part watchmaker, creates a mechanical brain, a clockwork intelligence, and places it inside the boy. So suddenly the child becomes extraordinary, brilliant, cold, calculated, politically gifted. He rises through diplomatic circles. People admire him, people trust him, and eventually he becomes engaged to a woman. The narrator is horrified by the idea that a woman could marry what is essentially a machine housed inside a human body. Now, stop right there, because let's think about the Neuralink, Elon Musk's idea of, putting the chip in the brain. But anyway, in this case, this narrator eventually becomes so obsessed with this that he removes the clockwork brain and throws it into the Atlantic Ocean. And that is the ending of that story. A mechanical artificial intelligence at the bottom of the Atlantic. But again, the important question is underneath the spectacle. Babbage had already imagined machines capable of calculation. Mitchell goes one step further. What happens if machine intelligence leaves the workbench and enters society inside a human body? What happens when it negotiates, strategizes, influences people, gains authority, rises politically? What happens when a machine can perform intelligence convincingly enough that human beings begin granting it power? That question has most definitely not gone away. In fact, I would encourage you to Google this or ChatGPT it. It is called AI 2027. Read that document in light of this story from way back then in the 1800s. Then there's another story he wrote. It was called The Crystal Man. A man becomes scientifically invisible. Now, Mitchell wrote this 16 years before H.G. Wells publishes The Invisible Man. Did H.G. Wells somehow or another get a hold of these writings and just hush it and just got inspired by it? We won't know. Mitchell doesn't treat invisibility as magic. He treats it as a strange physical phenomenon. Again, the imagination is asking, what if our assumptions about matter and perception are incomplete? And that same year, which was 1881, Mitchell publishes The Clock That Went Backward. Two cousins inherit an old Dutch clock. Lightning strikes during a storm, and suddenly they find themselves in the year 1574. Yes, time travel. During the historical siege of Leiden, they encounter actual historical circumstances. One of the men becomes involved with a woman named Gertrude, which happens to echo the name of the great aunt connected to the mysterious clock back in their own century. Mitchell never completely explains what happened. He simply leaves the impossible sitting there. And remember, this is before time travel became one of the standard toys of science fiction. So once again, Mitchell isn't necessarily giving science the answer. He is stretching the question further than ordinary reality allowed. And this is where I started becoming interested in something larger than Edward Page Mitchell. Because when you start digging through the 19th century, you keep seeing people suddenly obsessed with the same kinds of things: electricity, invisible forces, communication across distance, spiritualism, mesmerism, machines, time, the human mind, other dimensions, the nature of matter. What exactly is consciousness? What does it mean to be human? And this is where my astrology comes into the conversation. Now, I am not saying a planet, in this case Uranus, made Edward Page Mitchell write about teleportation, please. The planets have enough accusations against them. What interests me as an astrologer is timing. There are periods in history when humanity appears to become intensely preoccupied with particular categories of questions. And astrologically, the 19th century is fascinating. Uranus had been discovered in 1781. By the way, when it was in the zodiac sign, and astronomically it was in the zodiac sign of Gemini also. And it was in opposition to Saturn and Mars in Sagittarius. Both of those have to do with expansion of thought, mind, and in Sagittarius' case is going beyond what is visible, beyond even what is provable. Now, Uranus happens to be the planet that astrology eventually associates with disruption, electricity, innovation, rebellion, technology, sudden breakthroughs, and radical departures from what we thought was possible. Neptune is discovered in 1846. And the 19th century explodes with spiritualism, invisible worlds, altered perception, mysticism, photography, mesmerism, anesthetics, imagination, and illusion. And then Pluto is discovered later in 1930. When astrologers look backwards, historically, we often associate Pluto with hidden power, transformation, psychology, forces beneath the surface, destruction, and regeneration. Now, does that prove planets cause these things? No, that is not what I'm saying. What I'm interested in is resonance. Why do certain questions suddenly become culturally loud? Why do multiple people who don't necessarily know one another begin pulling on similar threads? This is one of the things I use astrology to examine. Patterns in time, not commandments from the sky. And now let me bring this down from 19th century newspapers and into something sitting in your hand right now. Artificial intelligence. Go pull that document, AI 2027, and read it. Research who it's from, who wrote it. I'm not going to tell you because I don't want to influence your thoughts on this. I want you to be objective. Just find it. I think you can go to, I think it's AI2027.com. I think it has its own website. And before anybody starts hyperventilating in the comments, no, I am not saying that AI is some kind of an oracle. I am not saying AI is God. Nobody is worshiping ChatGPT over here, okay? There is zero church happening in this video. What I am saying is that there is a principle involved in how we approach information, and that principle is very old. Let me bring in the tarot now, because in the tarot there is a card called the High Priestess. Now she sits between two pillars. She guards the entrance to knowledge, but she does not chase after you. She does not grab your hand and say, sweetheart, you seem confused. Let me decide what you need to know. No, you approach her and you had better know why you came, because there is a difference between asking a question and simply opening yourself up to whatever information happens to come through. That is true when you approach an oracle, and it is true when you sit in front of a computer and type something into AI. I am not comparing the machine to the oracle. I am comparing the responsibility of the person asking the question. If you don't understand your own inquiry, if you don't know what you're actually seeking or asking, you create a void, and voids get filled. Ask vaguely, you might get something vague. Ask the wrong question beautifully, you may receive an extremely convincing answer to something you never actually meant to ask. So the High Priestess principle is clarity before inquiry. Clarity is your protection. What am I asking? Why am I asking it? What information am I actually seeking? What am I going to do with the answer? Because protection is not always about putting something around yourself. Sometimes protection is knowing exactly what door you are opening before you walk through it. And then we get to the Hanged Man, Neptune. The Sacred Pause, card number 12 of the Major Arcana. The High Priestess is card number 2. Now, the moment when your original position stops working, the Hanged Man says, turn it upside down. Look again from a different perspective. Maybe the problem isn't that you haven't found the answer. Maybe you're standing in the wrong position to see it. Maybe you're asking the wrong questions. And I think that is exactly where humanity is with artificial intelligence. We are standing in front of something enormous. Some people are terrified of it. Some people want to worship it. Some people want to hand it every decision they make. Some people want to smash it with a hammer and return to 1987. I wish we could do that, but we can't. And here's what the Hanged Man says. Wait. Change your perspective. Ask better questions and keep your own sovereignty while you listen to the answer, because that's the only way to deal with whatever fear you have. That is why I dig through these old stories. Not because I think Edward Page Mitchell or any of these other writers literally saw the future, not because I think every old novel is secretly prophetic, and not because history is sending us coded messages through Victorian newspapers. Sometimes a writer recognizes a question before science develops the language to answer it. But what I want to trace is human beings have been thinking about artificial minds, invisible forces, instant communication, time, machines, information, and the boundaries of reality for a very long time. AI did not suddenly fall out of the sky in 2022. It arrived at the end of a very long human conversation. Edward Page Mitchell was part of that conversation. And for nearly a century, we forgot he was even in the room. That is why we're going back into these books. Because sometimes imagination gets to the question before science gets to the answer. And why does it matter to you? Because if you don't use a muscle, you lose it. And AI is now absorbing all kinds of information from our books. And once you read AI 2027, that document, you'll see what might be coming down the tubes and what already is in play, the layering of this and what's going to happen, when it's going to happen. What does 2027 have to do with it? What will 2028 and 2029 have to do with it? Will AI replace all of the jobs? How will any jobs be protected from the AI that is now not even AGI, but it's called superintelligence. It is being trained, by the way, so that it can write its own programming. And here's the part that scares me. In essence, this AI superintelligence is being formulated, very modeled after a human brain, a smart one. We might have, I don't know, a billion neural connections, and I'm a lay person in this, I don't know how the wording exactly to say it, but the AI that they're building, hundreds of trillions, thousands of trillions of these connectors. And the thing that scared me the most was when I heard this man say, you know, if something was made of code, which I thought that AI and algorithms were all made of code, evidently I don't know what I'm talking about. They're not. And what he said was scary, because what he said was, if something was made of code, you can read the code and you can see if it deviates from the program. He was referring to, what if AI becomes so smart that it just starts fooling us and doing what it has its own agenda and it can't be managed. And he says in this particular superintelligence, there's no way of finding that, because there's trillions and trillions of connectors. So you don't have any way of seeing what the AI is planning. Hello. So I'm going to connect this back to that barbell basket that everybody was talking about, and now everybody's moved on and they're talking about the Lionsgate portal, if that's even a real thing, and they're talking about the next, eclipse, and they forgot about this. But the barbell basket was in connection, it's called, to the Groshon cyclical index, which is what they studied, and that's this ascending and descending, reaching a summit, reaching a low point curve that they've been following. So there are things happening in the pattern readings that are correlating with the predictions that the people who are actually building the AI are also pointing to. That's it. That's all I've got for you. This is Ritualistically Botanica, and apparently we have some very old books to open. I'll keep opening them. Bye now.